It flies on the B-2 stealth bomber today, yet it was born in the mud of 1918. A century of service, zero fundamental changes. Modern military tenders now take decades to move from paper to prototype. John Moses Browning and John Pershing did it in months. The Great War created a problem. German ground attack aircraft appeared over the trenches. They carried armor plating. Standard .30 caliber rounds simply bounced off the steel. General John Pershing saw the failure. He needed a hammer. In July 1917, Pershing sent a formal request. He demanded a weapon with a caliber of at least half an inch. The muzzle velocity had to exceed 2,700 feet per second. It was a massive leap in physics. Browning took his water-cooled 1917 design and scaled it up. The result was the .50 BMG. Designers took the .3006 cartridge and enlarged it. They added data from captured German anti-tank rifle ammunition. It was an anomaly of engineering. A round with enough kinetic energy to tear through steel and bone with equal ease. The first prototype reached the range on October 15, 1918. The 1918 tests promised a revolution. Post-war reality delivered a disaster. 1 week after the armistice, the project hit a wall. For nearly 2 decades, the weapon looked like a total failure. The original M1921 model used water cooling. It weighed 121 pounds. The feed mechanism only worked from the left side. This single mechanical limitation made the gun useless for half the available mounts. Air cooling offered no escape. Without water, the metal couldn't cope. After only 75 rounds, the barrel reached its breaking point. Metal groaned. The steel fractured. The technical stats were a death sentence. Low muzzle velocity, sluggish rate of fire. A full ground setup weighed up to 170 pounds without a single bullet. Infantry couldn't carry it. Small aircraft couldn't lift it. Vehicle turrets couldn't fit the lopsided feed system. By the 1920s, the military saw no future for the heavy caliber. The Army relegated the project to coastal anti-aircraft batteries. It was a niche tool for a war that had already ended. John Browning died in 1926. Browning was gone, but his engineers refused to let the project die. Between 1927 and 1932, they solved the weight and heat issues. A universal receiver allowed ammunition feed from either side. A heavy barrel stopped the metal from melting. By 1933, the M2HB was ready. It weighed 84 pounds. It fired up to 575 rounds per minute. It hit targets 2,000 yards away. Why did the infantry need such power? Engineers had one goal: pierce armor. The physics were brutal. One round delivered 15,000 foot-pounds of energy. Compare that to a standard pistol of the era. A handgun produced 500 foot-pounds. The M2 was 30 times more powerful than a soldier's sidearm. In 1933, one shot carried the energy of an entire 10-round burst from a submachine gun. The bullet struck a steel plate. The impact created a white-hot flash visible for miles. The heavy slug tore through 1 inch of hardened armor at 100 yards. The exit hole was a jagged crater. The machine was no longer just a weapon. It was an engine of kinetic destruction. The world was sliding toward 1939. Europe went to war. Think. Engineering triumph met human terror in the belly of the Boeing 17. On the ground, the .50 caliber was a masterpiece of ballistics. In the clouds, it became a cage. The Sperry ball turret hung beneath the fuselage like a glass organ. 44 inches across. That is smaller than the diameter of a tractor wheel. To fit inside, the gunner had to become an embryo. How do you fight in a space that small? You fold. Only men 5 feet 4 inches or shorter could squeeze between the twin M2 receivers. The hatch hissed shut. The latch clicked. Inside, the air turned thick. It smelled of hydraulic fluid, ozone, and cold sweat. The gunner sat on a tiny bicycle seat. His knees pressed against his chin. His feet rested on the glass. Below him, 4 miles of empty air. Statistically, the ball was the safest spot on the bomber. It was a tiny target. But the math didn't stop the screaming. To exit, the gunner had to rotate the sphere manually to align the hatch with the fuselage. If the electric motor died, he grabbed the hand cranks. He turned them until his muscles burned. If the gears jammed, the ball became a coffin. One hit to the turret mechanism changed everything. The gunner would look up through the plexiglass and see the belly of his own plane. He was trapped. He carried no parachute. There was no room for one. The pilot would check the landing gear. Green lights stayed dark. The hydraulics were gone. To save the crew, he had to land on the belly. The bomber descended toward the tarmac at 120 miles per hour. The gunner was still in the sphere. He was the lowest point of the aircraft. The pilot cut the engines. He held the flare. He touched down on the reinforced aluminum skin. The armor-piercing reality of the ground war changed at 30,000 feet. Gravity and speed rewritten the ballistics. The strategy was simple. Fly above the flak and let the guns handle the rest. It failed. German interceptors reached the bombers in relentless waves. They didn't just intercept, they hunted. The B-17 Flying Fortress became a bristling porcupine of steel. 13 machine guns, 9 different positions. Out of a 10-man crew, the majority were not pilots or navigators. They were gunners. Their job was to kill or be killed in a storm of lead. Why did the aviation version differ from the infantry's heavy M2? Weight and speed. The AN/M2 weighed only 61 pounds. The ground version weighed 84. Engineers chopped the barrel to 36 inches. But the real transformation was internal. The ground gun chugged. The aircraft gun screamed. An infantry M2 cycled at 500 rounds per minute. The AN/M2 reached 850. Some units were tuned to 1,200. That is 20 bullets every single second. A wall of lead. The math of the dogfight demanded it. A German fighter streaks past at 400 miles per hour. You have a window of 2 seconds, maybe 3. If you don't fill that space with metal immediately, you are dead. At those rates, a ground barrel would melt in a minute. In the sky, the solution was the environment. The freezing slipstream at high altitude stripped the heat away instantly. Air at -60 degrees acted as a constant high-velocity coolant. -60 degrees. At 30,000 feet, the air turns into a razor. The 8th Air Force flew in unpressurized holes with open windows. This wasn't just a flight, it was a struggle for biological survival. German fighters were the secondary threat. The primary enemy was the altitude. In the waist gun positions, the wind blast was constant. By 1944, frostbite accounted for over half of all medical casualties. If a heavy Browning jammed, the gunner faced a lethal choice. Fixing it required precision. Precision required bare hands. The skin froze to the steel instantly. Metal tore away flesh. Some men left their fingers on the receiver. In 1943, the cold killed and maimed more airmen than Flak or Messerschmitts. One-ball turret gunner later admitted the truth. By the time they reached the target, they were too frozen to care about living. The 8th Air Force suffered. Their casualty rates surpassed the Marine Corps, the Army, and the Navy combined. To go home, a crew had to survive 25 missions. Mathematically, it was impossible. Only 33% of crews ever finished a tour. While bomber crews froze in the thin air of the stratosphere, Lieutenant Audie Murphy was burning on the ground. January 26, 1945, Holtzwihr, France. The temperature dropped below zero, but the forest was screaming. 200 German infantrymen emerged from the fog. 6 tank destroyers followed them. Why did he climb onto a machine that was seconds away from exploding? Murphy had a simple answer. They were killing my friends. He ordered his men to the tree line and turned back toward a crippled M10 tank destroyer. The vehicle was a Roman candle of steel and gasoline. Smoke billowed from the hull. Murphy climbed the chassis. His boots gripped the hot metal. He reached for the spade grips of the M2. The .50 caliber started to bark. Below his feet, the fire licked the fuel tanks. One spark would vaporize him. Murphy didn't move. He stood upright. No shield, no cover, just the heavy barrel and the rhythmic thump of the Ma Deuce. Heavy brass casings ejected into the slushy snow. Steam rose where they hit the ice. He caught a German squad crawling through a ditch and erased them. For 60 minutes, he held the line alone. The heat from the burning M10 scorched his face. A German bullet tore through his leg. He ignored the blood. He kept the trigger depressed until the last ammunition belt rattled through the feed tray. Only when the gun fell silent did Murphy jump from the blackened hull. The M45 quad mount represented the peak of American kinetic power. 4 M2 machine guns synchronized on a single electric turret. It tracked targets at 60 degrees per second, faster than any manual mount. It didn't just fire, it erased everything in its path. 2,000 rounds per minute, 40 bullets every second. Soldiers called it the meat chopper or the kraut mower. Originally, it hunted the Luftwaffe, but by the Battle of the Bulge, the German Air Force was a memory. The Allied gunners looked down. They aimed at the tree line. If a sniper hid in a tree, they didn't look for him. They simply cut the trunk in half with a 5-second burst. Could a human survive this machine? For the gunner, the answer was technical. On the M45, the shooter sat in a cage. On the Sherman tank, he was a target. The M2 sat on a pintle mount behind the turret. No armor, no shield. To fire, a crewman had to climb onto the engine deck. He stood completely exposed while the turret moved at high speed. It was a mechanical paradox. The weapon was unstoppable, but the operator was a ghost waiting to be made. The Army valued the .50 caliber over the 75mm shell. It was cheaper to spray a suspicious bush with 500 rounds than to fire one tank round. A single burst cost the taxpayer less than a missed high-explosive shell. Crews accepted these suicidal conditions because the .50 caliber rewritten the rules of cover. It was not a machine gun. It was a portable autocannon. The 12.7mm round changed the physics of the engagement. A standard brick wall stopped a rifle bullet. The M2 turned that same wall into flying shrapnel. A sustained burst simply collapsed the structure. German infantry in 1945 learned a hard lesson. Concealment was no longer protection. Does a brick wall provide safety? No. The .50 BMG punches through concrete and maintains enough kinetic energy to bisect a human target on the other side. The sound was the first warning. It wasn't the rapid chatter of a light machine gun. It was a heavy, rhythmic thud that vibrated in the chest of everyone within a kilometer. The Wehrmacht began to fear the meat chopper more than the Sherman's main gun. Even a Panzer IV was vulnerable. A single well-placed burst shattered optics and shredded tracks. Thinner side armor could not keep the heavy slugs out. In the Pacific, the situation was even more lopsided. Lightly armored Japanese tanks were routinely perforated by heavy machine gun fire alone. The violence of the impact birthed a persistent myth. Soldiers claimed the Geneva Convention banned the .50 caliber for use against personnel. This is false. International law never prohibited the round, but the origin of the lie is clear in the field hospitals. A hit to a limb resulted in instant amputation. A hit to the torso resulted in total structural failure of the body. The Wehrmacht learned to hide from the M2. But in Korea, the enemy decided to simply drown the weapon in bodies. Tactically, everything changed. The Korean War turned the .50 cal into a machine of mass industrial slaughter. Gunners on M45 quad mounts faced the Chinese human wave. Thousands of infantrymen charged at once. It was no longer a skirmish. It was a harvest. Veterans described the effect like a sickle cutting through wheat. What happens to steel when the density of targets exceeds the rate of cooling? The metal fails. The air smelled of scorched iron and ozone. 4 barrels fired in a synchronized roar. They never stopped. The heat reached 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. This surpassed the limits of the alloy. The barrels began to glow a dull, rhythmic red. Then, the steel softened. The heavy tubes actually started to sag under their own weight. Gunners kept buckets of water nearby. Between waves, they doused the weapons. The water hit the red-hot steel and exploded into thick, blinding steam. They had no choice. A single M2 fired 500 rounds per minute. Against a mass of 10,000 men, that was nothing. The Quad 50 provided the necessary math of survival. 2,000 rounds per minute. Precision became a separate necessity. Gunners began mounting telescopic sights on their M2s for long-range kills. They turned a heavy machine gun into a makeshift sniper rifle. This technique reached its peak in the jungles of Southeast Asia. They installed the optics and waited. In Korea, telescopic sights bought time and distance. In Vietnam, the war closed in until you could see the enemy's eyes. The Mekong Delta turned the Brownwater Navy into a target. 4 men on a fiberglass hull. The patrol boat, River, or PBR, carried twin 50 cals in a forward turret and a single mount at the stern. The hull offered no protection. Fiberglass stopped nothing. A standard rifle bullet passed through both sides of the boat like paper. Armor was heavy, speed was the only defense. The math of the Delta was simple and lethal. Ambushes triggered at 100 yards or less. How often did the crews face the fire? In River Division 531, the answer was daily. The gunners stood behind thin shields, exposed from the waist up. They were the first to fire and the first to die. During the peak of the conflict, the casualty rate hit 6% per month. For a sailor on a 12-month tour, the odds were a trap. 3 out of 4 men in a crew would be killed or wounded before their rotation ended. Heroism wasn't a choice, it was a statistical certainty. This small force became the most decorated naval unit of the entire war, earning 2 Medals of Honor and 14 Navy Crosses. The price of those medals was paid in hulls. River Division 531 lost 7 of its 10 boats to rocket fire in just 40 days. While the Navy shielded its ships with thick layers of steel, the Army's M2 gunners in Iraq remained the loneliest men on the battlefield. Sergeant First Class Paul Ray Smith understood the odds. He wrote to his parents before deployment, "There are 2 ways to come home, stepping off the plane and being carried off the plane." He told them it didn't matter which way he returned. Why stand tall under fire when the math says you won't survive? For Smith, the answer was the 100 men behind him. April 4, 2003, Baghdad International Airport. An Iraqi force swarmed an American unit. The crew of an M113 armored carrier went down. Smith didn't look for cover. He climbed onto the hull. He gripped the spades of the M2. No gun shields, no ballistic glass, just a man and a heavy machine gun in the open. Enemy fighters closed in from 3 sides. Smith held the trigger. The heavy barrel vibrated against his chest as he poured fire into the tree line. Below him, medics scrambled. 100 soldiers took shelter in a nearby aid station. That was a full infantry company. Smith became their only shield. He stayed on the gun until a single round struck him in the head. He was the first Medal of Honor recipient of the Iraq War. Protection remained a luxury. 19-year-old Ross McGinnis learned this in Adamiyah. December 4, 2006. McGinnis sat in a Humvee turret. It was a metal ring exposed to the rooftops. Suddenly, a metallic clatter echoed inside the cabin. An insurgent had tossed a grenade through the hatch. "Grenade!" McGinnis screamed. Training dictated one move: warn the crew and jump out of the turret. Save yourself. McGinnis did the opposite. He looked down at the 4 men in the seats below. He shifted his weight. He dropped his back onto the steel floor, pinning the grenade against the armor with his own body. The blast muffled against his vest. McGinnis died instantly, leaving the other 4 soldiers without a single scratch. Smith and McGinnis died because of engineering reality, not tactical failure. In the early days of the Iraq War, the Humvee was a transport vehicle, not a tank. Early models featured aluminum hulls. The metal was paper-thin. A standard 7.62 mm rifle round passed through it like a hot wire through wax. Expectation: a heavy armored transport. Reality: an unshielded aluminum box. The gunner was the most isolated man on the battlefield. Why stand in an open hatch with 0 protection? There was no choice. The turret ring had no armor plating, no ballistic glass, no steel shields. To fire the M2, the soldier had to expose half his body. Insurgents adjusted quickly. They stopped aiming for the engine. They aimed for the hatch. Snipers looked for the silhouette. Grenades were dropped from rooftops directly into the open turret. When an IED detonated under the chassis, the vehicle's floor shredded into jagged fragments. The thin armor failed to stop the upward blast. Shrapnel tore through the gunner first. Iraq was not the first. 40 years before the desert, on Route 19, crews learned the same brutal lesson. September 1967. A convoy of the Transportation Corps enters the Central Highlands near Pleiku. In 10 minutes, an ambush destroys 30 trucks. The road becomes a graveyard of burning steel. The Army ignored the vulnerability of the drivers. 19-year-old kids realized the system had abandoned them. They stopped waiting for orders. They found scrap metal. They stripped armor plates from downed aircraft and rusted holes of old APCs. The weld lines were jagged and crude. It was the geometry of desperation. By 1969, over 100 of these gun trucks patrolled the jungle. These were rolling fortresses, unauthorized and illegal. The crews salvaged M45 quad mounts from World War II surplus. They bolted M60 machine guns to the cabs. They welded the M2 heavy barrel directly onto truck beds. These teenagers turned supply haulers into heavy combat platforms. While drivers welded scrap metal for survival, a Marine sergeant adapted the M2 for cold-blooded precision. Carlos Hathcock saw the machine gun differently. He saw a sniper rifle. 1967, Operation Utah. The heat shimmered off the valley floor, distorting targets in the 8-power Unertal scope. Navy Seabees had machined a custom bracket. They bolted the optics directly to the heavy receiver. Hathcock sat on a hilltop, his tripod locked. He zeroed the weapon at 1,000 yards. Then he looked further. Could a machine gun hit a target 2 miles away? It could. Hathcock spotted a Viet Cong fighter. The man was pushing a bicycle loaded with weapons. The distance was 2,500 yards, almost 1.5 miles. The bullet would need several seconds to reach the mark. Hathcock watched through the glass. The fighter bent over to brush his teeth. Hathcock squeezed the trigger. The heavy barrel didn't move. The projectile arched through the humid air, high above the canopy. The man stood up at the exact moment of impact. That record stood for 35 years. It was a mathematical impossibility turned into a kill. This single shot redefined the limits of the .50 BMG. In 1982, Ronnie Barrett studied Hathcock's long-range data. He used those ballistic charts to design the first practical .50 caliber sniper rifle. Barrett founded Barrett Firearms Manufacturing. Hathcock needed legendary skill and nerves of steel. Today, an operator only needs a joystick. Technology finally caught up to the ballistic perfection of the M2. The Army rushed the common remotely operated weapon station to Iraq in late 2004. They called it CROWS. Can a machine preserve lethal power while removing human risk? Inside the armored cabin, the gunner sits in total darkness. Only the green glow of the screen illuminates his face. He sees the world through day and night cameras. A laser rangefinder feeds data to a computer. It calculates ballistics instantly. The system hits moving targets with 95% accuracy. The gun remains on the roof. The soldier stays under armor. By 2013, over 8,000 of these stations were in service. It is the final evolution of the Browning design. The M2A1 variant added a quick-change barrel and a manual safety. But the internal heart of the weapon remains unchanged since 1918. The hardware outlives the flesh. In 2015, the military finally retired serial number 324. It had been in active service for 94 years. Browning's creation has survived a century of warfare. It currently serves in the arsenals of 100 nations.